Today's really about a good news story. I think, as Rochelle mentioned in the introduction, regenerative agriculture is not just about regenerating our landscape functions, healthy soils, etc. It has profound implications on human health. And I'm going to just do a different thing at the end of the talk concerning Roundup, because I'm getting more and more concerned about it, glyphosate, more and more concerned by the minute. So really, what we're talking about is healthy landscapes, healthy food fibre, and healthy people, planet, etc. So it's a profound statement, but there's plenty of evidence to support it. But first we need to confront some of the issues that are in front of us. And where I'm still attached at the Australian National University, Fenner School of Environment and Society, just down the corridor are some of the world leaders in not just climate, but Earth systems. People think the whole debate is about climate. It's actually about 7 other interconnected systems with it, and 7 out of those 8 are in dire strife, and hence the conclusion by leading scientists that we've moved out of the safe period of the Holocene, during which agriculture evolved, which led to human civilization, but also the mess we're in. We've moved into a new phase, anthropo, caused by us this time. And I'll be arguing that the only people that have a really important, profound, long-lasting solution to it are we farmers and the food consumers that will support us. And that's extraordinarily exciting stuff. So, as you can see from those rats examining that snake, we are in deep strife at this moment. So really, the Anthropocene, as I've just said, is about us moving into a whole new phase of Earth's history. And I have no hesitation in saying it's the greatest crisis that humanity's ever faced, much bigger than world wars. They're like storms in teacups compared to what we're faced with. I first encountered the issue way back in 2015-16. I was doing a job for an aid organisation in Myanmar, Burma, in the central dry zone. And at that time, they'd had 20 years of total climate disruption. Their monsoonal rains come off the Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal, and they'd been shot to bits over that period. 40% down on rainfall, monsoon rains coming later and then not being repeated and irregular. And what was a strong village society, grazing society in a healthy grassland landscape has now been reduced, as you can see there, to just thorny shrubs because it's been eaten out by the sheep and the goats, and the rivers have now turned into sand rivers. So for a number of people in the world, climate change's been around for a while and drastically affecting the entire social structure, as in this case. I'm not going to go through all the key components, but if you look at that blue-green planet out there, which is our Earth, a lot of people don't realise it was actually life itself that created conditions for life. 3.1 or 2 billion years ago, it was bacteria that put oxygen up into the atmosphere. And as Walter Yaner may mention later, because he knows a lot more about this than me, but it was algae and fungus, for example, that started to break down rocks, which led to our first soils. And then came the great plants who started to put up the first carbon dioxide. So it was life that actually created conditions for the life we know it today, and it's life, us, that's now disturbing those conditions. I'm not going to go through all those 8 Earth systems, all of which are interconnected. The only one that's we've just pulled back in time from was the whole ozone layer issue, which could have been devastating if it hadn't been held up. But the other 7, if you look at the research, industrial agriculture, the worst aspects of it, is, if not the major player, one of the major players in disturbing all those. And the first 3, climate, biodiversity, and the interrelated nitrogen and phosphorus cycles have now been pushed beyond safe levels, and we don't know when we're going to get to a tipping point of what's going to happen. And the others are rapidly being pushed closer. The converse of that, if industrial ag is a major player, ergo, regenerative ag can be the one that turns it around. And that's the story I want to explore today. And so, as I say, this is grounds for hope, not for slashing our wrists. And I actually, playing on the soil thing, etc., etc., because having written a book about world politics, I have no faith in Canberra and the political establishment. The solution's not going to come from that end. It's actually going to be the people, the farmers, and those that are going to support our healthier food. So I call it an underground insurgency. So I'm a revolutionary. I'm preaching revolution here. I won't bore you with the book, except that it was by talking to extraordinary farmers that obviously led to the book. And it came out of I had to take over the farm at the age of 22 when my father had a heart attack, 4,500 acres on the Monera. Growing up on a farm doesn't mean you know anything about farming, about managing farming. And so I proceeded to ask the best advice, CSIRO, Department of Ag, best farmers in the district. And I became a really good industrial farmer. I set stock and lost valuable perennials. I ploughed a sandy paddock, had a big storm and it was gutted. And I guess the worst mistake, and talking to David Marsh and others, and Tim Wright, both of whom are here, it was the 80s drought was the big head cracker. And I had the arrogance to think, well, I can fight this bastard. And so I kept most of our stock. We had a merino stud, and we fed ourselves into a huge debt and belted the landscape. And I still grieve over the damage that I did. And I'll come back to what the implications of those mistakes were. But just to finish the research on the book, I went right across what you could call regenerative agriculture spectrum, from holistic grazing to biological agriculture, biodynamics, agroforestry, etc., etc. Any movement that was turning to regenerate natural systems rather than beating the crap out of them, basically. So I really wanted to make a tapestry of the book, wonderful stories from farmers and others who'd made the change, but at the same time teaching ecological literacy. And by that I mean, as I'll explain in a minute, I couldn't read a landscape, which is why I belted it. I was landscape illiterate. But first, if you think about the first settlers that arrived here, and most of them weren't farmers, to farm, they encountered this extraordinary landscape of ours. Now they came from northwestern Europe, post-glacial soils, chock full of nutrients that have been washed out by the great rivers and the ground down mountains and all that sort of stuff. Very humid, both soil-wise and climate-wise. And they came to this landscape of ours. Up to 3.8 billion years old, some of our soils, highly leached. And sitting underneath is this burden of salt that's accumulated over all that time. And, and you get that wrong, you get hit behind the ear within 30, 40 years. The other thing that they had no way of knowing, because we're only just learning about it, is that because of that unique continent of ours, 3.8 billion years, the western 2/3 is many billions of years old. Dry continental interior, we get no aerosols coming off ocean currents or nearby continents. And with those scarce nutrients like phosphorus, the functions of our ecology under the soil and even above had to make do with this incredibly scarce amount of nutrients. So that the most extraordinary ways of cycling scarce nutrients in the microbial world, and with energy and nutrients above as well. So it functioned far more complex because it's had a lot longer to co-evolve than the European system. And so that's what the early settlers walked into, understandably. And so we ended up with what we see around us. And this dryland salinity is still increasing. So to summarise, what those settlers brought was what you could call a mechanical mind. If you think about indigenous societies, and even as that painting on the bottom left by Bruegel the Elder shows a medieval peasant society. They still, you could say they had an organic mind. They still saw themselves as an indivisible part of Mother Earth. Their religious cycles, etc., reinforced that. Then we went through the extraordinary period in European history of the Renaissance, scientific revolution, industrial revolution, capitalist revolution, which then took us to this extraordinary phase of economic rationalism where we think endless growth for the sake of endless growth and destruction is going to get us somewhere. But it was that mechanical mind that came to Australia, and they just saw this as a substrate to extract profit from, and even Indigenous people as some sort of worthless entity. So that's what was behind it, and that reigning mechanical mind is what still drives our society, both in agriculture largely, and certainly in the economics and all the philosophy behind our politicians. So essentially nature's the enemy is one way of looking at it, and one of the things I did in my thesis, I analysed the advertisements that the rural press were doing. And this was a full page ad, about 2010, inside front cover and full back cover of all the major rural weeklies. It's an advertisement for Roundup glyphosate. So you've got the big end of town employing psychologists to work out the ads it's going to play on us farmers. So there we've got a white pointer attacking the soil. Have a look at the Roundup drum, sexy eyelids, sexy smile. And embedded in the language is things like trust your killer instincts. So the mechanical mind, well and truly embedded. And the other thing I'd like to say before I get onto the stories is that I was at a university institution where every second paragraph had the word sustainable. And I just think it's passé. It means marking time now to me, treating water. We need something that's open-ended and regenerative. And that's what regenerative's all about. We're only just beginning to discover in the soils, etc. If you let nature get on with it, she will self-organise back to health and into situations we'd never imagined. And so that's why I stress the word regenerative, as has been pointed out here. So I alluded to my own journey, trained in the mechanical mind. And then I made all the mistakes, and then I began, because I had interesting clients in our merino game who were early adopters, many of them were adopting regenerative practices, and that's what got me thinking. And I reflected on it, and a landscape like that, I couldn't read that. I couldn't realise it probably should have been in intensive care and hospital. That's how landscape illiterate I was. And it was from that I realised there's a hell of a story when I've spoken to all these regenerative farmers, why they've moved to where they are and what they're doing. What's missing for someone like me, like I was a basic toolkit that would help me understand how this complex landscape worked. I mean, there's hundreds of cycles you could go and do, chemistry and weathering and all the rest of it. But I was able to reduce it down to a few simple functions. And if that photo there is a fence line on the Monero, same temperate grassland. And I guess like many here today, I've moved from one side of the paddock to the other, but it was all due to that, as one farmer said, that 1 square foot of real estate up here. The worldviews and the paradigms that we take on. And so combining some of the thinking from ecologists and people like Alan Savory and others, I think you can work how a landscape functions down to these 5 basic functions. We all know that it's the solar that drives the whole thing. Plants put sugars into the soil, gets the soil biology going, and they either lay down carbon or drive the whole process from there. And if you think about it, human civilization is built on our fossil fuels, so, a fairly important process. The water cycle, getting more absorbent soils, getting more carbon in them, getting more air spaces, getting a biology to create air pockets and changing the whole colloidal structure, etc. Soil mineral, fairly basic, and Walter, we're privileged to have one of Australia's leading soil scientists, I'm sure is going to touch on some of that. Biodiversity or complex dynamic ecosystems, really critical. People have always underestimated just how fundamental that is. And the one I've added goes back to that fence line photo, that square foot of real estate, the human social, the paradigms and worldviews that are imposed on it. So if you look at the arrows on that diagram, you can't separate any one of them. If you disturb one, it's going to disequilibrate all the others. We're all just so tightly connected. So I'm not going to bore you going through all the others. It's plenty of the classic textbooks will tell you. But I mean, I see my role as a manager at home, and we're grazing, to stack on as many solar panels as I can on that ground, green, chloroplast, etc., for as long as I can for the whole year, and drive those sugars to drive the whole process. So it's a fairly simple equation, and without getting more complex, but that's the basis too. And some of you would have seen this photo. I was privileged to stay with Norman Crew in the Karoo region of South Africa. That's the fence line boundary today between his farm on the left and a neighbour on the right. When he bought that country in the 70s, all his country was like the right-hand paddock. Had to walk a kilometre to find a perennial. He immediately instituted an holistic grazing approach. And we're talking about country that 400 years ago, before the Dutch and English arrived, had rivers full of hippopotamuses in it. And now you can see that country on the left, he's more than tripled his stocking, his income's even more than that, more than triple. You can see how absorbent and soft the soil is and the diversity of forbs, shrubs, grasses. It's remarkable. If you drive that solar, which then drives the water and all the rest of it, what can be done? This is courtesy of Terry McCosker, who's here today, one of the leaders, I think, in the whole regenerative ag movement in Australia. One of his clients up near Bowen. That top left, that red arrow is the same tree in the landscape as your marker. Flogged out for 100 years, that ground was rock hard, and you get big rain events in the tropics. You know, Wooshka, most of it would run off. It's an impenetrable soil in most cases. And the bottom right, that's only 10 years after shifting to an holistic grazing approach. Building up absorbent soils, ground cover, and those solar panels working as long as you can. Bottom left is an erosion gully that was steep-sided, fully active, and in 10 years, using animal impact of hooves, the battens are now down to 45 degrees and it's regenerating. So, you know, it's regenerative, it's remarkable stuff. And the new cropping innovations, whether it's Colin Size, Bruce Maynard, and as I'll allude to later, the Haggertys, who are going to talk later. If you look at that centre photo, that's traditional cropping. A lot of bare ground, a lot of compaction. After harvest, a lot more bare ground, 80s, 90%. They've turned things on their head and are cropping through winter dormant native grasses, you see, fours, etc. Edible canolas and wheats, so you can rotationally graze to stimulate the biology that way. And then top left, as they're harvesting, in that case 3-tonne oat crop for Colin Size, your C4 grasses are waking up. So your green solar panels and ground cover have escalated enormously, and that's the basis to what's a far greater resilient system. If not the productivity up there, the costs are down and resilience enormously. And this is a photo of a holistic grazer in Mexico. That blue arrow in those two photos is the same point in that landscape. And 27 years after that left-hand photo, a lot of water in that left-hand photo, but it's all poured off the rock-hard ground above. And on the right, no water visible, but it's probably 10,000 times more water embedded in that landscape, just through that shift to get those cycles going. I've rejigged here, getting onto the third function, soil mineral. I've rejigged Elaine Ingham's soil food web, which is fundamental sort of metaphor that came into regenerative farming. And you can see the sun top left and stuff. I mean, I went to uni about 40 years apart and did soil science 40 years apart. And the second burst around, they still hardly mention biology. It was all physics and chemistry. And yet this is the key. And mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria and worms. Funny to say that here today, but all absolutely fundamental, but being totally ignored. But they're the precious cargo that we have to regenerate. And that's how we've treated our soils in the past. As a young, silly student, mountain climbing in New Zealand, we walked across red ice where it had melted down, and that was the 1930s Nulley. Millions of tonnes of soil from Broken Hill, Mallee, Wimmera, Western New South Wales, South Australian pastoral country. Millions of tonnes. And as I've said before, maybe not the right metaphor for Victoria, but the All Blacks in New Zealand don't give us any truck. Why should we give them our scarce nutrients? And I've seen, there are 4 other historical examples of that mass movement. Same time, that one's the same time as the American Dust Bowl. We don't hear about the Australian Dust Bowl. And in the last 5-6 years, I've seen dust blowing, and you see it on people tracing. So we're still doing it. And it's not the past just either. I was cutting across the Liverpool plains to interview a guy actually who's in the book, tucked under those blue ranges at the top of the photo. It was a dry season. They had 8 mils the night before, 8 mils of rain, and I came through the next morning, about 12 hours later, and saw that and stopped. I mean, we're talking about some of the best volcanic derived soils in Australia and some of the best in the world. So there's a fence just beyond the railway line. I hopped over, and this soil was hugely dense crust and no structure. It had been so over-ploughed, so oversprayed, so over-fertilised, it was totally dead. And water that should have disappeared in 5 minutes, still there 12 hours later. And Christine Jones sent me this recently. This is Gabe Brown's soils up in west of Chicago in the States, doing pretty impressive stuff with multi-species cropping, but also grazing. That's his soil sitting on the shovel underneath. And if you look, probably can't see it there, you can see earthworms, brilliant colloidal structure, wonderful air spaces and stuff. My guess is if you put a penetrometer in, probably a couple of hundred PSI. Just over the fence is his neighbour, traditional cropping, industrial cropping. So low bulk density with Gabe, high bulk density, my guess would be a penetrometer. If you'd be flat out, you'd probably break it putting into that, but maybe 1,000 PSI. Walter might have a better idea, or other good soil people here. So that's the potential of getting those functions going. And it's transforming. And the Haggertys who are here today, some of the most remarkable innovation, and it's ongoing. That's the beauty of what they're doing, which is basically turned agriculture on its head by rejecting industrial fertilisers and most of the chemicals and combining 2 different lots of biology. I won't preempt Di, she knows a bit more about it than I do, but it's for good reasons. They're calling it natural intelligence agriculture, because what they've done, as Rochelle alluded to, was stepping away and let Mother Nature get onto it. And I heard that phrase so much in my research. My job, regenerative farmers were saying, like David Marsh and others, look, all I'm doing is stepping out of the way and letting Mother Nature get on with it. We're empowering her. And so the word natural intelligence agriculture, and we were talking at breakfast today, it's still mind-boggling how the biology is locking up toxins or releasing something else, and pH rising. One of the stories, Graham Maddox told me that their soils without any lime went from about 3.4 to 6.4 or something remarkable, just through this biological change. So, and they're using sheep, holistic grazing, over the cropping system. Now I used to have clients in Western Australia, and I'd go and visit them about November when the tap turns off. And this Department of Ag and CSIRO advice, all you need is a subclover system in the Mediterranean world. So they'd fill up the silos and then wait for it to rain in May, and the country started to look like that. That's only this year, that photo. No ground cover. You can imagine the soil biology, how it's surviving, and compaction and all the rest of it. So here's a photo of the Haggerty's operation. Fence line comparison on the left. This is just after harvest. I mean, Haggerty's probably don't like me saying it, but I sometimes feel I should take an umbrella and a beach towel and a sand bucket. It's basically beach sand. They're farming on some of these Western Australians. And that's their paddock on the right. And on the top photo is the neighbour's paddock, traditional, after harvest. Look at the bare ground. Imagine how the bugs are surviving a Western Australian summer. And below now, as the Eden Dye Haggerty are getting recruitment of perennials and God knows what else. I remember going to the West 5 years ago, and everyone said, you'll never get the recruitment that the East gets in the lost perennials, etc., etc. Well, that's a fairly good living example. And we've now got research that if you put all these functions together, soil, solar, water, our soils, because of the carbon, etc., that's laid down, can store at least another 144,000 litres of water per hectare. And this is the driest continent on Earth that we're handling. And then there's the biodiversity factor. You know, your insect and bird control and the whole biodiverse function that there's no way we can anticipate in the way it serves to protect our productive systems. And just one quick example, some really wonderful innovators in agroforestry west of Melbourne, the Otway group. These are the Stewart family. That strainer post there is the same post in each photo as the marker. The country was probably 80% forested by the time Andrew Stewart started. Bottom left photo, that got down to 2% natural vegetation. So he said, we better do something. Erosion gullies, you name it. And that's within less than 20 years, that photo on the right. So he's gone back to over 20%, but on the original area, his production's gone up. Better landings, calvings, more water held, etc. But at the same time, he's stacked in at least seven other enterprises, 4 or 5 from the forestry, which they're already harvesting, bush tucker, cut flowers, and now, because the property is a beautiful property, agro-tourism and that sort of stuff. So suddenly the social, economic and environmental resilience is gone up enormously. And an area that people are waking up to, but I was lucky to work with one of the world's leaders in Fred Provenza at Utah State Uni, who's looked at the grazing layer that we, speaking for myself, I never saw a vertical component to grazing. It was always what I could put on the ground. But shrubs were part of the history of our animals that co-evolved. And shrubs are stacked full of 10,000 times more nutrients than grasses. And they provide all sorts of benefits. Deep-rooted, bringing up the nutrients. We now know from research in South Australia that the nutrients are moving out 3 or 4 metres into alleyways after about 10 years of working with things like Tagasasti, tree lucid, saltbush, etc. So it's a huge potential, and you don't have to tell the Spaniards or the Portuguese. They've been doing it for centuries with diverse stacked enterprises coming off. And so that brings us to that square foot of real estate, the one between years. And really it all comes down to how we're approaching it, and I suspect that's why this room is fairly full. It's people wanting to learn whether we can do something better or just having a look, but it's all about mind change or mind reinforcement, etc. And that photo pretty much sums it up. I mean, it's a very powerful example. It's a wonderful metaphor for the power of the mind. And I've been there. I've been on both sides of the fence, so I can speak with painful experience. Now, I think I mentioned that I met so many top regenerative farmers who kept saying, my role is to get out of the way of Mother Nature. And going back to uni, I had 30, 40-year catch-up on ecology, systems thinking, all that, and things like chaos theory and physics. And out of that had come a pretty good understanding of how complex adaptive systems work. And that can be the World Wide Web, but it can also be our farm or an ecosystem. There's about 12 major components, which they're getting a pretty good handle due to systems research. But the one that really hit me in the eye when I thought about those farmers saying my job's to get out of the way is the capacity of these systems, if allowed, they will self-organise back to a state of health. May not be where it was originally, but it's back to functional health. And that's what we're seeing everywhere. And so I think that's the most, and Rochelle touched on it, that's the most exciting concept, that if we empower it, nature will get on with it in the most extraordinary fashion that we couldn't even imagine. And if you could do the same thing twice, it'll still be different because other factors are working. So how's this working and how's it addressing the Anthropocene? I've been privileged recently to get to know and now work with a guy called Paul Hawken, who's been one of the world's leading social and environmental changers and activists. Written some wonderful books in the past, The Ecology of Commerce, Blessed Unrest, and now he's just edited this major study on how we could either draw down carbon, the book's called Drawdown, Penguin published, or prevent carbon going up. Hundreds of scientists have now costed this, beautiful illustrations right through. And he was speaking when I was in Melbourne at a conference, and he only covered the top 20. And I went up to him later, and number one, by the way, is if we could rejig the gases in refrigeration, you'd save about 90 gigatons going up, carbon dioxide. But in the other 19 in that top 20, there was 5 regenerative ag approaches that he'd separated. And I said to him, if you combine them into one, regenerative ag's number one by about 15%, and I haven't even gone through the other 80. I'd say we're about 50% in front of any other way, any other approach to pull carbon down or prevent it going up. That's how important regenerative ag. We're number one to provide a solution to this huge Anthropocene crisis. Because once we get the carbon story right, it impacts all the other cycles. So those other 8 Earth systems, or the 7 that are really in danger, all those are impacted by what we do driving this. And the only research study so far done on this that I'm aware of, a university team from Melbourne studied the eyes just out of Canberra, and they've sequestered more carbon than I think 11 times their total farm emissions in the last 30 years, and they've taken their soil carbon from 1 to 4%. So it's happening, it's doable, and we can play a huge role. I just want to lead in now to the whole story that's connected to what I'm talking about, which is healthy food. And the talk tonight, we're really privileged to have a top nutritionist come and talk about things like the gut microbiome. The key point, why I've got those 2 photos on the left, is that as a species we co-evolved for upwards of 1 million years in the African savannas, and we're hardwired for our body to detect shortages in nutrients, our alimentary canal, our organs, our gut, sending messages to the brain which will come back and say, look, I'm short on X, Y, Z. For both the nutrients out of food that the women hunter-gatherers get, both medicinal and nutritional, but also that the men are hunting game, but they're not just hunting meat. Those animals were browsing animals as much as grazing, and so they have 10,000 times more nutrients to access. And so those also we are hardwired for the key ones. And so all I'm saying is just be very careful about some of the food fats. You do not want to exclude a major source of nutrients that you may not get from plants. And what are we doing today? That could be another form of where the human species is going. Just give you one example. The hunter-gatherers are hardwired, and so are we, to lay down fat, because they have good times and hard times. So they need a reserve laid down, and if you want to stack away energy, like fill up your petrol tank, fat's the way you do it. The trouble is, as that person on the right shows, our diet is now full of fats and sugars, etc. And we don't get the exercise of a hunter-gatherer. So, we're contravening what we've been evolved for. And just going back to the shrubs, why we need to access healthy meat off healthy landscapes. That just gives you an example, bottom right, of the tens of thousands of nutrients, whether they're phenolics or terpenes or whatever, that are in browsing shrubs. And our domestic animals still have that ancient knowledge. And things like Australian wattles, full of tannins. When sheep has intestinal worm or a cow, they know to go nibble the right wattle to get the tannin, which will knock over a bit of that worm burden. For example, they still have that animal wisdom, as we do as humans. There's another component to what we're doing, and that's what we're doing to our food. And that's just a research study, won't go into the detail, but the more we push modern industrial breeding in wheats and other staples, the more there's a compromise. So we've gone to dwarf wheats, and they're also bred to be drug addicts to respond to the nutrients we pile on. But the compromise, and this has now come out in research paper after research paper, the compromise is a huge crash in nutrients. Now, a lot of the key nutrients, not just for our immune systems, but our entire cell and physiological function. And the same's happening with vegetables and fruit. You know, there's plenty of studies, dozens and scores of papers now. Apples from 1914, same variety, same state, California. Today, 5% of iron that they had in 1914. So if you're going to breed for cosmetics and production and pump them up to be dependent on fertiliser and high irrigation, there's huge compromise. And anyone who's eaten heritage fruit or veggies, that extraordinary taste is all about nutrients, which have now been stripped out. And the guy that gave us modern medical ethics, Hippocrates, allegedly said this: "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." And it's a profound statement. What I want to do now, in the last segment, the more research I'm doing and the more I'm talking to leading American scientists and researchers and leaders in Australia, Terry McCosker and others who are also looking at it, is, I think, it's the elephant in the room. I think this glyphosate story is absolutely frightening and absolutely enormous. The more the research comes out, the more horrific it's becoming. And not just because it's destroying soil biology, which I'll go into briefly in a minute, but it's targeting our entire health function coming out of our gut microbiome. And I think there's a massive vulnerability here. There's this huge global reliance on glyphosate, nearly 1 billion tonnes going out now. A lot of it due to GM. And that GM food, let's not forget, in the corn, soy, canola area is some of the corn syrup which penetrates all our industrial food system, for example. It goes into animal feedlots, where I personally don't think, as farmers, we're being tainted by that now. It's a difficult one, that. But it's going that path. So it's not going directly to humans, and the corn syrup is causing horrific damage as far as fats and sugars. We now know it's in basically all our major food staples, the whole way through for that pathway I've just described. They're finding it wherever they look. Also, even in breast milk, that's its penetration, and we've been told it doesn't, but it does, and I'll explain why, what's happening. Guys like Bob Kramer, who works for the US Department of Ag, incredibly courageous guy, because he's now exposing some of the key things that glyphosate just does in the soil, destroying soil biology, exacerbating the wrong bacteria which release too much nitrogen, killing off the favourable bugs, etc., which I list there. And so it goes on. I won't go into all the technical details. Hopefully you can see some of it there, but it's literally so counterproductive to a healthy agriculture. And there's now dozens and dozens and dozens of papers. Initially you couldn't research this in the States because Monsanto and company would kill your tenure at a university. But now it's coming out due to brave people like Kramer, but also this guy, Don Huber, which some of you I'm sure have heard some of his talks on nutrition. A wonderful soil biologist. He didn't exaggerate it. He survived a hit He's been speaking out against Monsanto for a long while. He physically survived an attempted hit on him within the last 2 years. That's how close to the mark he must be. And his research into physiological effects, and he's come out of soil biology, let alone its impact on animals and humans and all the modern crops, is very sobering. And a lot of people don't realise that the key function, glyphosate was discovered because it had the ability to strip pipes of accumulated metals, etc. So they thought, well, that's a pretty good one, we may be able to use in agriculture. That's how Monsanto picked that up. So what it does, it has a chelating action. That means its function is when you put it in, when you spray it over a plant, it grabs all in the minerals and locks them up, and the plant dies. That's why when you spray a paddock with glyphosate, it turns yellow. The problem is, when it gets into our body, it does the same. Well, first of all, we're eating food that's lost a lot of its nutrients, not just because of the breeding, but because of being sprayed with glyphosate. But when it gets into our body, it takes out and clumps and makes unavailable a lot of the very key nutrients for our physiological function, our immune system, etc. And Cuba goes through the effects, which I won't bore you. The slides are a bit noisy. These are his slides. Nutrient deficiency, increased levels of toxic products, etc., premature aging. I'll show you in a minute. Basically, the correlation with the takeoff of GM in our key foods is about a 95% correlation in all the major modern diseases. Now, that's not proof, but you'll see how persuasive that it's not an accident, that there's too high a correlation. The other, there's a lot of this stuff I've come across since I did the book, but one of the key papers, when researchers were able to freely start working in Europe and America without being clobbered, were by a couple called Sampson and Senev. And they examined nearly 290 biomedical and medical papers on glyphosate and concluded that without doubt, glyphosate is the worst environmental factor in our entire environment and in our foods, and it's having devastating impact. And they list the key reasons why, which I'll touch on briefly in a minute. One of them is it gets into our gut, and then it interferes in the whole amino acid pathway. Now that's the whole basis of our proteins. If you think about hormones and enzymes, the whole way we function. It's called the Shikimati pathway. Monsanto said, no. When it was first mentioned, they said, no, it's not a problem. Mammals don't have that pathway. And they're right. We don't have it. But the half of us that drives our system, our gut microbiome, it's as much weight there as our entire brain and 10 times more DNA. They have the pathway. So Monsanto is a huge cover-up because that's what was being targeted. So the gut bugs that drive our entire immune system, their capacity to develop that immune protection was taken out by this, is taken out by this chemical. And that's without going to all the soil impacts that Kramer and Huber can tell you about. And look, I won't read all that because I'm going to show you in some graphs in a minute. But basically they said, they looked at from about 96, the huge takeoff, which I'll show you a second, of use of glyphosate because of GM and the rise of modern diseases, extraordinarily parallel. And that's no accident. And so they list, in their view, glyphosate is implicated in all the modern major diseases. The immune system, ADDH, autism, allergies, etc., penetration into the brain, Alzheimer's, all that sort of stuff, cancers, and so on and so on. I mean, isn't it extraordinary why in the last, since the mid-90s, this is unbelievable takeoff in the modern diseases. So the two key reasons that I list there why glyphosate is so powerful is what I've just explained, the interference in the gut of the amino acid pathway. We now know it's water soluble. In fact, there's evidence now that Mississippi, where about 70% of glyphosate runs into, is now glyphosate's going up in evaporation. And it's people that aren't even near the farming areas are now copying glyphosate in rain, etc. So it's totally penetrated our environment. And being water soluble, when it gets into the gut, it's now penetrated the two key barriers you don't want penetrated for a healthy body. That's the gut barrier and the blood-brain barrier. And that's just on the Shikimati pathway, which I won't go into. That's our gut microbiome, which is only becoming far more bit better known now. All sorts of weirdo things going on in there, and weirdo bugs, as you can see, bottom right-hand side. But until now, we've neglected what is a key part of our own bodies. And that penetration of the gut barrier lining plays a major role in a healthy gut, where you've got the Shikimati pathway working, of preventing any toxins penetrating the gut and getting into our blood system. We now have this leaky gut syndrome, which is correlated with a lot of the debilitating gut and other physiological diseases. More crucially, or equally crucially, it's now crossing an even more sensitive and powerful barrier, the blood-brain barrier. And so the rise in autism, ADDH, all those sorts of things, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, it's now looking like this is a huge causal effect as well. And it has tetragenic effects. It's now getting into fetuses and changing the genetic coding, etc. More and more research coming out in animals and poultry and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, it's in our food, and we can do something about it though. And that's just some of the correlations, some of the modern diseases there. And the red line is the explosion in the takeoff after GM of glyphosate. And the bars of those key diseases is a correlating rise in all those modern diseases. It's sort of beyond, if you're a scientist and you see a correlation that high, you say, yeah, it's not conclusive proof, but hell. And it's more than circumstantial evidence. And some of the leading researchers are now looking at the escalation in autism, which is going up, it's compounding, for some of the factors that I've just mentioned. And you can see the parallel curve between the red line of glyphosate and autism in the bars. But the rate that it's going means that there's maybe epigenetic and other effects. And I probably haven't got time to get into epigenetics, except to say that we do interact, our genes do interact with our environment, and hitherto it was always thought that you only had genetic change through mutations or whatever in the DNA. We now know that the environment can cause, it won't change the DNA, but it will cause genes to switch on and off. That's called epigenetics. It's only sort of a field that's emerged in the last 15 years or more. And what triggered people to it, what was known as the Dutch hunger winter in the Second World War, and the Germans pretty well, a lot of the Dutch population. 1944, April into 45. Now, any mothers who were pregnant in that time, they were doing a long-range research, scientists, social scientists in Europe, and they weren't looking for this. They just studied what happened to the children that were who were in utero in that period. And when those children grew up to teenagers, they suddenly found double, triple disease effects that the cohorts that weren't fetuses in that time had. And not just physiological, greater obesity, but ADDH and the whole spectrum. And an even more disturbing result was that the children of those children, and the grandchildren of those mothers that were originally pregnant, they're now having parallel effects. So it's almost certainly been a genetic change due to that stress in that utero. And glyphosate now appears to be having this compounding effect on top of its other effects. So I guess what I'm saying is that our ancestors, our mothers to ourselves, as that squirrel says, when he realised his diet was, that's why he was nuts. But as I say in the book, and we've all heard the saying, we are what our we are what we eat. Epigenetics tells us we are also what our mothers and grandmothers ate. That's the implications of epigenetics, if we don't eat the right stuff. And look, just quickly, we stress genetics as the mechanism of evolution. Not appreciating that genes do dialogue continuously with nature, so we're not separated. And I've got my wrong set of glasses on here, but hopefully you can read that. I'm saying that when future historians write about our times, they're not going to write about the tons of chemical we didn't apply. But this is Don Huber. They're going to write about our willingness to sacrifice our children and jeopardise the very basis of our existence and the sustainability of agriculture. Putting another spin on that, what I'm saying, I'm asking the question, are we all, those of us that are now into a healthy regenerative agriculture, are going to be dragged down by what's going to happen when the full glyphosate story hits, and before it's almost inevitably going to be banned? It's already been declared a cancer in California. Europe's been trying to shut it down with the pressure of the Bayer merger, $150 billion company with Monsanto. Has probably stopped that cancellation in Europe. It will come, and what I'm worried about is, are we all collectively going to be dragged down? And if you want to really get a good YouTube, have a look at this guy, Zach Bush, top medico in the States, and doing lots of research. I've checked him out with scientists and others in the States, and he's the real deal, and a brilliant communicator and with a medical practice. And he started off dealing in autism, and that's what got him on this whole pathway. So look, it's time I wrapped up. I don't want to leave you depressed, but it'd be reprehensible of me not to raise what I think is this huge issue on the horizon, and we need to keep our eyes on it. Not being too dramatic, for all the reasons I'm saying, whether it's the Anthropocene or the human health story, as a species and a planet, we are on the edge. So we've got two options. One of them is we could go down the pub and join Eric Idle and sing Monty Python's Galaxy Song. So remember, when you're feeling very small and insecure, how unlikely is your birth, and pray that there's intelligent life somewhere in space, because there's bugger all down here on Earth. I'm more optimistic. There's no doubt, I think, in what I've just put in front of you, given Paul Hawkins' work on drawdown and what we can do with turning around ecosystems, that regenerative agriculture, is going to be front and centre to our futures. I've got no doubt. And yeah, we're the problem, but we certainly are the solution. And the secret, as I mentioned before, is us enabling Mother Nature to get on with her self-organising capacity. That's millions of years of co-evolution to do what she does best. Whereas we arrogant, mechanically minded humans think we can control things. And when you do that, we eventually muck it up. One of America's leading environmental historians had this to say about good farming: making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life. And regenerative agriculture does that. So it's a wonderful field to be in. But we need to shift from the mechanical to the organic mind, as Looney invariably puts his finger on. Now, I guess what I'm saying is we now need a new story for our time. Economic rationalism, growth for the sake of growth, and endless destruction has had its day. It's tipped us into the Anthropocene. Only the big end of town benefits. So we now need, as this saying attributed to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children and grandchildren. And I think that's the key message I want to leave you with. The responsibility of us to regenerate Earth and have health delivered into the rest of the community is enormous. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.